cheating enslavers out of a name they never chose, buried plantation ledgers that sat unread for more than a century, and a bloodline that leads straight back to one specific stretch of the African coast. If you carry one of these 15 surnames, your last name is not just a label your family inherited, it is a fingerprint. And over the last decade, DNA testing has quietly uncovered what that fingerprint has been pointing toward all along. Here is what most people were never told. When slavery ended, millions of black families were given freedom, but almost nothing else. No records, no birth certificates, no way to know which village their grandparents had been taken from. For many families, a surname was the only clue left behind. Some of those names came from the men who enslaved them. Some were chosen out of thin air the day they walked off the plantation. And some were quiet acts of rebellion, deliberately chosen to say what the old world never allowed them to say. For the next 150 years, those names sat there looking completely ordinary. Then the DNA databases became large enough to change everything. Researchers began comparing modern DNA with the original shipping records of the transatlantic slave trade. What they found was astonishing. Certain surnames appear again and again in specific regions. Those same regions were connected to ships that departed from particular African coastlines. And when you follow that trail all the way back, countless families are discovering that the American surname they carried for generations had been quietly preserving an African origin the entire time. These are 15 of those surnames, counting down to the one researchers describe as the single most revealing surname a Black American can carry. Stay with me, because the top 3 will completely surprise you. Before we get into the list, do one thing right now so you do not forget. If your family name appears anywhere in this video, leave it in the comments along with the state your family is from. We are building a map in real time. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that one combination, your surname and your location, is the key that unlocks everything else. While you are here, subscribe. Because every week we break down a different set of surnames and trace their African origins. You do not want to miss the one your own family name has been hiding all along. All right, let us get into it. Number 15, Jones on paper. Jones is about as un-African as a surname can get. It's Welsh through and through. It simply means son of John, and it's one of the most common last names in the entire English-speaking world. But here's where the story turns. A striking share of black families named Jones traced directly back to the low country of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the ancestral homeland of the Gullah Geechee people. And that coastline was not buying labor at random. Rice planters there wanted people who already knew, in their hands and in their memory, how to farm flooded rice paddies. That exact skill existed on one stretch of West Africa, the so-called Rice Coast, in what is now Sierra Leone. Slave traders knew it, they marketed it. Captives from the rice-growing regions sold at a premium in Charleston Harbor for the simple reason that they already knew how to do the work nobody else could. So when descendants of low-country Jones families take a DNA test today, an unusually large number of them light up with matches to the Mende and Temne peoples of Sierra Leone, far more than you'd expect from a name this common. There are documented Gula families who kept singing songs, word for word, generation after generation, without knowing what the words meant, songs that researchers eventually traced back to specific villages on the other side of the ocean. And that's how one woman traced a girl named only Priscilla in an old bill of sale all the way back to the exact port she sailed from, a slave trading post called Bunce Island, built specifically to funnel rice country captives into Charleston. The English surname was the disguise, the rice was the tell, and the DNA was what finally finished the sentence. Not a bad way to open the list. But the next name hides its secret even better. Number 14, Brown. Brown started life as the plainest kind of nickname, somebody with brown hair, brown skin, a brown coat. It spread through England and Scotland like a cold in winter, and today it's so common it feels like it can't possibly be hiding anything. That's exactly why nobody looks twice at it. Brown families are scattered across nearly every state in the country. But there's a dense cluster running through the Carolinas and up into Virginia, and in early Virginia specifically, one region dominated the slave trade above every other, the Bight of Biafra, in what is now southeastern Nigeria. That means Igbo ancestry, Ibibio ancestry, Efik ancestry, three closely related peoples of the Niger River Delta, whose language, food, and customs seep so deeply into early Virginia that traces of it are still detectable in the culture of the region today. When brown descendants out of the Virginia and Carolina backcountry get their results back, that Nigerian signal shows up again and again frequently as the single largest slice of the pie. The flattest, most forgettable name on this entire list turns out to be one of the strongest arrows pointing straight at the Igbo homeland. Remember that region. By the way, the Bight of Biafra is going to keep resurfacing tonight, and by the end you'll understand why it might be the single most important thread in this whole story. Number 13, Smith. Smith is the most common surname in America, and it's an occupational name. It simply meant blacksmith. Now sit with what that meant on a plantation. The man who ran the forge wasn't just another laborer. He was often the single most valuable enslaved craftsman on the entire property. He fixed the plows, shoed the horses, mended every broken tool the operation depended on. Without him, everything ground to a halt. And the historical record shows something remarkable about how these men claimed their freedom names. There's a documented case of an enslaved man, known only as Bill, the one who runs the forge, who walked into freedom and became William Smith. He took the trade itself as his family's name. Others did the same with mason, cooper, carpenter. The work was the one thing this country had never managed to take from them, so they wore it like armor. And that matters for tracing ancestry, because ironwork carried enormous cultural weight in specific parts of West Africa. Blacksmiths were revered, sometimes even feared, treated as men who could bend the raw earth to their will. Especially across the Bight of Benin and the interior of what's now Nigeria and Ghana. In many of those societies, the smith sat close to the king, because the man who forged both the weapons and the farming tools held real power over whether a people ate or starved, fought or surrendered. That knowledge did not vanish in the crossing. Enslaved metalworkers in the American South forged the iron gates and ornamental work that still stand in Charleston and New Orleans today. And Smith families with deep blacksmithing roots frequently pull West African matches from precisely those metalworking regions. A name that sounds like it, means absolutely nothing, turns out to be a receipt for a trade that survived the ocean. Number 12, Banks. Banks is a topographic name. It just meant your family lived near a riverbank, a hillside, an edge. Plain, English, unremarkable, and yet Banks shows up in census data as a surname carried by a strikingly high percentage of Black Americans, far more than you'd expect from a word this ordinary. Its heaviest concentration sits in Maryland and the wider Chesapeake. And Maryland's trade had a signature all its own. Captives brought into Maryland's ports came largely from two very different corners of the continent, Senegambia in the far west, and West Central Africa, the Congo and Angola coast, thousands of miles to the south. So Banks' descendants tend to split down one of two very different roads. One leads to the Wolof and Mandinka world of the Western Sahel Muslim empires, with a written tradition and trade routes that crossed the desert centuries before Columbus. The other leads to the Kingdom of Congo, a Christianized state that had ambassadors standing in European courts before the Mayflower ever left port. One surname, two completely different doorways, and DNA is the only thing left that can tell a given family which door their people actually walked through, because the distance between a Wolof line and a Congo line is bigger than the distance between a Norwegian and a Sicilian. Which brings us to a name that got scrambled worse than any other on this list. Number 11, Coleman. Coleman carries a double origin. In England, it could mean a charcoal maker. In Ireland, it traces to an old saint's name. Either way, it landed hard in the American South and put down roots across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, the heart of the Cotton Belt. And that location tells you almost everything. After 1808, when it officially became illegal to import captives directly from Africa, the domestic slave trade exploded to fill the gap. Roughly 1 million people were marched or shipped south, out of the older states of Virginia and Maryland, into the new cotton frontier, chained in coffles, sold at one auction block after another, families ripped apart at every stop along the way. They carried their Biafran, their Senegambian, their Congo ancestry with them into that migration. And the Cotton Belt mixed all of it together into something new. So Coleman descendants today often show one of the most blended African profiles on this entire list. Not one clean region, but a little bit of everywhere, because the internal slave trade took the map of Africa and shook it like a snow globe. The name stayed rooted in one place. The bloodlines behind it got stirred into something that had never existed before, on either side of the ocean. In its own strange way, that mixture is its own kind of answer. Number 10. Gaines. Gaines is an English name with Norman French roots, and it attached itself to several very large slaveholding estates across Virginia and Kentucky. That connection to specific big plantations is exactly what makes this name so useful to researchers, because large estates tended to buy from the same suppliers year after year, which means the African origins tied to this name came in concentrated, not scattered. The Virginia-Kentucky pipeline leaned heavily on the Bight of Biafra in its earliest decades, then widened out towards Senegambia and West Central Africa as the trade shifted over time. But there's another thread tied to this name that's impossible to walk past. The surname Gaines belonged to Archibald Gaines, the enslaver of Margaret Garner, a woman whose desperate act during an escape attempt in 1856 became one of the most haunting stories in American history, and later the inspiration for a novel that would go on to win the Nobel Prize. So Gaines is a name where the paper trail runs unusually deep court records, newspaper accounts, plantation ledgers, and where DNA and documented history can finally sit side by side and check each other's work. For a lot of families, that pairing is the exact difference between a story passed down and a fact you can hold in your hand. We're at the halfway mark. The names only get bigger from here. Number 9, Williams. This one earns its spot for a completely different reason than the rest. Williams is Welsh, another son of William. And it isn't the surname carried by the highest percentage of Black Americans, but in raw numbers, more Black Americans carry the name Williams than any other name on this entire list. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people, because Williams spread evenly across every single southern state instead of clustering in one region. That means it doesn't point at one African homeland the clean way Jones or Brown does. Instead, it behaves almost like a cross-section of the entire Black American experience, compressed into a single word. Put 100 Williams families in a room and test every one of them, and you'll find Igbo, Yoruba, Mende, Congo, Fulani, and Akan ancestry all sitting shoulder to shoulder. If you wanted to understand the full sweep of where Black America actually came from, you could almost do it just by studying people named Williams. It's not the sharpest name on the list. It's the name that contains all the others, which also means no two Williams families should ever assume they share an origin story. One line might trace back to a rice village in Sierra Leone, another to a Congo town 1,000 miles south, and both would be completely right. That's the strange gift of a name this common. It doesn't hand you a single answer wrapped in a bow, the way some of the rarer names on this list do. It hands you a doorway, and it's on you to walk through it and find out which particular hallway your family actually took. For some Williams families, that search ends in a fishing village on the Sierra Leone coast. For others, it ends deep in the interior of the Gold Coast, among people who once ruled entire kingdoms. The name gives you the doorway. The DNA gives you the address. Number 8, Davis. Davis is Welsh son of David, and it drags a heavy historical shadow behind it, thanks to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. A large number of enslaved people on Mississippi and Louisiana plantations ended up carrying that surname. And after emancipation, many of them kept it not out of loyalty, but because it was the only identity the paperwork would recognize when they went to marry, buy land, or vote. The lower Mississippi Valley drew captives from a wide net, but two sources stand out above the rest: Senegambia and the Bight of Benin. That means Bambara and Wolof ancestry from the dry Sahel in the west, layered with Fawn and Yoruba ancestry from the humid coast of what's now Benin and southwestern Nigeria. The Yoruba influence in particular left a signature you can still feel today, in the drumming, in the spiritual traditions, in the rhythm baked into the whole region. So, Davis descendants from the Deep South's cotton and sugar country often carry that blend. And the Yoruba thread tends to run especially strong. A name tangled up with the losing side of the Civil War turns out to point right back towards some of the most artistically and politically powerful nations West Africa ever produced. The name was a scar. What's underneath it is a crown. Number 7, Dorsey. Dorsey has Norman and Irish roots, coming from the old French form Dorsey. And on the census, it's one of those quiet surprises, a surname carried by a striking percentage of Black Americans relative to how uncommon it is overall. Its true heartland sits in a handful of Maryland counties. And Maryland's trade, like we saw with Banks, drew heavily from Senegambia and West Central Africa. But here's what makes Dorsey stand out. These families cluster so tightly in those same Maryland counties that genealogists have managed to reconstruct entire extended cousin networks, tracing them back through the same handful of estates across 200 years. That kind of density is rare, and for researchers, it's gold. When Dorsey families test today, the Senegambian matches come back clean and unmistakable, the Mandinka and Fulani world of the upper river valleys. Herders and traders and scholars of the western savannah, many of them Muslim, many of them literate in Arabic, long before they ever set foot in this country. Surviving documents, handwritten in Arabic by enslaved West Africans in the American South, still exist today, a fact that quietly demolishes the old lie that these were people without learning or history. Dorsey is proof that a surname doesn't need to be famous to be precise. Sometimes the quiet, tightly regional names draw the straightest line home, while the famous ones scatter in every direction. Speaking of names that break every rule on this list, number 6, Charles. Charles is different from everything else here, because it usually wasn't a surname to begin with. It started as a first name, from the old Germanic Karl, and it became a family name most often in French colonial Louisiana, among the Creole community and the free people of color, who built a world unlike anywhere else in this country. Louisiana's African story runs deeper and stranger than almost anywhere else on the continent. Under French and then Spanish rule, the colony brought in enormous numbers of captives from Senegambia, above all. The Bambara of what is now Mali, so many that Bambara language and custom became something close to a common tongue among the enslaved population there. Later waves arrived from the Bight of Benin and from Congo, carrying the ring shout, rhythms, and spiritual practices that would eventually feed into the birth of jazz itself. That Bambara core is still unusually visible in Louisiana DNA today, layered over a strong Congo foundation. You can even hear echoes of it in the old accounts of Congo Square in New Orleans, the one place in this country where enslaved people were legally permitted to gather, drum, and dance on Sundays, keeping rhythms alive that had crossed an ocean in memory alone. So if your family carries the name Charles out of Louisiana, your ancestry very likely reaches back to the Bambara heartland of the Niger River and the Congo of Central Africa, two of the deepest, richest wells in the entire diaspora. From here on, every name on this list is a giant. Number 5, Freeman. Freeman is the one name on this entire list that was almost never an accident and almost never a leftover. When emancipation finally came, some families made a hard, deliberate choice. They refused to keep the surname of the person who had once claimed to own their bodies. They wanted a clean, total break, a name that announced exactly what they had just become. So they became Freeman. It wasn't a description, it was a declaration, spoken out loud, in a country that had spent centuries insisting they were property and nothing more. Because Freeman was chosen rather than inherited, it doesn't trace back to one African region through a single owner's estate the way most of these names do. It traces back to a state of mind. These families came from every corner of the trade, from the Rice Coast all the way to the Congo Basin. What actually unites them isn't geography. It's that they were among the very first people in this country to consciously reach back and reclaim an identity that had been stolen from them. And that instinct never left. When Freeman descendants take DNA tests today, they're often the most determined of anyone to chase the answer all the way down to a single people, a single region, a single name buried in an old ledger. The results span the whole coast, from the Akan of Ghana to the Congo of Angola. The surname was the first act of self-definition. The DNA test, 200 years later, is the second. Same fire, same family. Number 4, Johnson. Johnson, son of John, is one of the most common surnames in America, and one of the most common among Black Americans by sheer weight of numbers, absolutely everywhere across the Deep South. And that flood of the name has a very specific cause behind it. After the transatlantic trade was shut down in 1808, the internal trade took over, and the Deep South became its final destination, the bottom of the funnel. Here's the fact that reframes almost everything on this list. West Central African ancestry, the Congo, and Mbundu peoples of Angola and the Congo Basin is the single largest African source of ancestry for Black Americans overall. Not Nigeria, not Ghana, Central Africa. And it runs especially deep through the Cotton States where Johnson families put down their roots. So a name that couldn't sound more plain, more English, more forgettable, is frequently sitting directly on top of a Central African bloodline that stretches back to the Kingdom of Congo, one of the largest, oldest, and most sophisticated states the African continent ever produced. A kingdom that was writing formal letters to the Pope in its own hand, while much of Europe was still climbing out of. The Middle Ages, the ordinary name, the extraordinary root. Number 3, Jackson. Now we're into the heavy hitters. On the census, Jackson is one of the surnames most strongly associated with Black America, with more than half of everyone who carries it nationwide being Black. It carries the name of President Andrew Jackson, and it's spread into every corner of the South. Because Jackson is both extremely common and so heavily Black, it functions almost like a national average of the entire trade, poured into a single word. But there's a specific Gold Coast thread worth pulling hard on here: the Akan peoples of what is now Ghana. The Ashanti and the Fante were transported across the Atlantic in enormous numbers, and their descendants are threaded all through Jackson families across the southeastern states. The Akan didn't arrive empty-handed. They carried their day names, the tradition of naming a child for the day of the week they were born. Names like Kofi and Kwame that survived in hidden forms deep into slavery. They carried a warrior tradition and a fierce, unbending sense of nationhood that fed directly into slave revolts across the Americas, from the Caribbean to the Carolinas. So for a great many Jackson descendants, the DNA reveal comes back to proud Ashanti and Fante ancestry, sitting quietly underneath one of the most ordinary-sounding surnames in the entire country. 2 names left, and the gap between them and everything else on this list gets wide. Number 2, Jefferson. Jefferson means son of Jeffrey, and it is the second Blackest surname in the entire United States. 3 out of every 4 people named Jefferson in America today are Black. That is not a coincidence. And it is not subtle. It points straight and hard at Virginia, at Monticello, at the plantation world of a man who sat down and wrote that all men are created equal, while personally holding more than 600 human beings in bondage across his lifetime. Virginia's earliest and deepest African source was once again the Bight of Biafra, the Igbo homeland. The Igbo presence in early Virginia was so overwhelming that it shaped the culture, the speech patterns, and above all the resistance of the entire region. It's the origin of the story of Igbo landing, where a group of captives, rather than accept a life in chains, are said to have turned together and walked straight into the water, choosing the ocean over bondage. When Jefferson descendants take DNA tests today, that Igbo signal comes roaring back to the surface, over and over. Sit with that for a second. The second Blackest surname in America, lifted from a founding father who preached liberty while practicing slavery, points more often than not toward one of the proudest, most defiant nations in all of West Africa. History has a strange sense of irony, but there's one name that stands above even this one. Number 1, Washington. There's no close second. Washington is the Blackest surname in America, full stop. No argument. Roughly 9 out of every 10 people who carry it are Black. Stop and actually sit with how staggering that is. The name of the first president. The name printed on the dollar bill in your pocket. The name of the capital city of the entire country. And 9 out of every 10 people who carry it are the descendants of the enslaved. Here's why. When freedom finally came, enormous numbers of families deliberately reached out and took the name Washington for themselves. Some of them had lived on estates connected to the Washington family, like the hundreds of formerly enslaved people in West Virginia and Tennessee who carried the name out into freedom after the war. But far more simply chose it clean, on purpose, because it was the name of the nation itself, and claiming it was a way of standing up and saying, "This country is ours too, we bled for it. We built it with our own hands." And those families came overwhelmingly out of Virginia and the Chesapeake, which means the same deep Biafran and Senegambian ancestry we've circled back to all night, running silently underneath the single most patriotic surname on the American map. The most American name a person can possibly carry turns out to be, statistically, one of the most African-rooted names in the entire country. And underneath it sit nations that were raising kingdoms and cities, while the word Washington was still nothing more than the name of a muddy little village in the north of England, centuries before it ever meant a president, a capital, or a currency. Think about the sheer audacity of that choice for a second. You've just been freed from a system that spent your entire life insisting you were 3/5 of a person, insisting the country wasn't built for you, insisting your name, your family, your very existence belonged to somebody else on a piece of paper. And your response, as a newly free person standing in the wreckage of that system, was not to disappear quietly into the margins. It was to reach up, take the single biggest name available in the entire country, and put it on your own children. That's not a small gesture. That's the real reveal here. Not that these names were secretly foreign the whole time, but that they were never as simple as they looked. Every single one of them is a knot tied by force, holding an American story and an African story together in the same breath. The surname only ever told you where the paperwork stopped writing. The DNA is what's finally telling you where the family actually began. And here's the part I want you to carry with you after this video ends. For most of this country's history, the entire plan was that this information would be lost forever. Erasing the old names, the old languages, the old ties. That erasure was designed to make sure no descendant could ever stand up and say, "I know exactly where my people came from." It was supposed to be permanent. It isn't final anymore. Between old shipping ledgers gathering dust in courthouse basements, plantation account books that some descendant of an old planter family finally decided to donate to a university archive instead of burning, and a cheek swab that costs less than a tank of gas, families are undoing in a single afternoon what centuries of deliberate, organized force spent generations trying to make impossible. So if you heard your name anywhere on this list tonight, you already know what to do. Drop it in the comments right now, along with the state your family calls home, because that pairing, your name plus your location, is your starting coordinate. Somebody reading this exact comment section might be sitting on the very plantation records you've spent your whole life unable to find. That's the part that gets me every time. The comment section under a video like this one has quietly become a place where cousins separated for 150 years finally find each other again. While you're down there, hit like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it's the only reason a video like this ever reaches the next family who needs to see it. And if you want to be here the moment we drop next week's list, going even deeper into these names and the exact African nations behind them, hit subscribe right now before you forget. Your name has been trying to tell you something your entire life. Tonight, somebody finally read it back to you.